welcome. Well, this is a spooky story. I'm calling this Rude Awakening because it really was my really first introduction to the world of what we call spirit. That maybe there's more to life than just the physical body and the mental mind. Um, I've been recently married. It's going back for many years now, and we just bought our first house, and it was in a town called Melton Mowbray, and it was a nice thing to do to buy a home together and move in. And we'd been in a few months, everything seemed fine, and then we went and got ourselves a dog, and it was a Doberman dog, and she was we loved the dog and took it for walks regularly. Anyway, one morning we got up, quite early, got up for an early morning walk, and we were coming back into the house, and it must have been about 7:30 in the morning, and the dog, whose name was Bess, she got to the door to the lounge, and she just stood there shivering and shaking and whimpering, and then turned round, promptly ran off, and went into the garden. And I thought, what's going on? And so we both, me and my wife, went out to see what was the problem with her, and she was hiding in a tiny gap between the kennel, squashed in between the kennel and the garden wall, shivering and shaking, and she just wouldn't come out. So we thought, well, just leave her be. And I went to go into the lounge myself, and honestly, if I can describe this in words, it's one of those hard things to describe. If it was a physical sensation of like a cold, damp mist really descending all around me, soaking into me, and I was like, "What is that?" It was felt so strange. And I walked into the lounge and then knelt in front of the fireplace. There was no fire on. I knelt there and I started sobbing my eyes out uncontrollably. And I didn't know what was going on. I really didn't. And my wife, um, she obviously was very worried and saying, "What's happening? What's happening?" I said, "I really don't know. I don't know." I said, "Call somebody, call somebody." I felt this urgent need. I must just call somebody. And I didn't know who or for what reason. Anyway, my wife, she said, "Who shall I call?" I just came out with your mum and dad. And that just came out to me to call them mum and dad. So she said, "They're on holiday." I said, "Well, call your brother." I didn't know who to call. And she said, "Oh, it's 7 in the morning." I said, "I don't know. I don't care. Just call somebody." So she called her brother, who said, "What are you calling me for this time of day?" She said, "Is everything all right?" She said, "Well, I'm just making sure you're okay." She said, "Is mum and dad okay?" She says, "I don't know. They're on holiday." And this last time I heard they were fine. She said, "Oh, okay then. Well, okay, well, see you later." Put the phone down. She came back in the lounge, and then suddenly everything with me seemed to just lift. It was like this cold mist thing had gone. I'd stopped crying. I came round, I stood up, and she's going, "What was all that about?" I said, "I really don't know." So we were both in a bit of a state of, confusion. I mean, my wife was absolutely freaked out. Anyway, a few days later, or the next day maybe, um, I was talking to the lady who lived across the road, quite senior in years, and I told her what had happened. And she said, "Well, there will be Mrs. Simpson." And I said, "Who?" She said, "Mrs. Simpson was the lady who owned the house before you bought it. And she'd been found, she'd died in front of the fireplace. And the doctor, when they found her, they thought she'd been there a few days." And she said, "Maybe she was just, the spirit was lingering and was there calling for help." And I was like, I was freaking out now, thinking, she said, if you feel concerned about it, call the vicar. Well, I, you know, I didn't go to church. Anyway, I spoke to my wife and she said, yes, we'll call the vicar. So the vicar and his wife came down and we gave him the cup of tea and a cake. And it was like a scene from a story. It's not real. And the vicar was saying, well, I believe the spirit was lingering here, needing help because she was in desperate situation, needing help and dying, and nobody came. She said, by the fact that spirit connected with me, I made a call and suddenly she's released and can move on. And the vicar said, I believe it's a benign presence and I believe you've helped her move on. But if something else more malevolent happens in the house, she says, I'll do an exorcism. And now my wife's here, and of course she is now way out of it. She just exorcism. We've seen the film The Exorcist, all this stuff. Of course, that comes to mind, all this horror, and you think, oh my God! And now she sees me as a, the in-betweenie, someone who's connected with somebody who's died. And honestly, this was a life-changing experience, because after that, I was attracting more and more people to me who had been in touch with spirit, who had alternative ways, who believed in different things, and I was drawn to this way. And I went on to join a spiritual group. I became a qualified spiritual healer. Meanwhile, the more I went on this journey, the more my wife resisted and feared it, and she stayed right in this fear mode. And eventually that, I believe, is what drove us apart, because I couldn't stay there. I was intrigued, was fascinated. I just wanted to know more and more about this subject. So there we are, Rude Awakening. If anybody's had anything similar, please mention it in the comments below. Anyway, thank you for watching, and excuse the shakiness of the camera. It's a bit of a breezy day, but yeah, blessings to you all.